Oleg threw a pile of papers on the table in anger and roared, unable to cope with his emotions. "What trash?" he exclaimed. "No, look at her. She's such a bitch." He paced around the office, then pressed the secretary's call button and demanded that she look for Andrei. "What Andrei?" Oleg Nikolaevich asked. The secretary Svetlana asked again. "Arkhipov from the economic department." "What is not clear here?" Oleg barked and in 5 minutes saw with a glance at the bewildered Andrew. "So Andrew, our project is on the verge of failure. There is almost no time left, and if I fail the investors, then I'll scatter all of you to hell. I'll ask you to take that into account and tell your economic department. Starting today, you'll be acting as chief economist. Is that clear? Of course, with a pay raise and compliance with all the regulations. But your responsibility also increases manifold. You will be responsible for everything your department does or doesn't do." "What about Olga Alexandrovna?" Andrew asked. "Olga Alexandrovna found herself another warmer place," Oleg replied, his voice quiet but ringing with rage. Andrew immediately lost the desire to ask him anything else. "I understand that the urgent appointment to this position may lead you to a stupor, but we have no time to waste. In 2 days, you must find an error in the calculations and provide me with perfectly calculated data. Ideally, after your work, the project will be simplified and optimized. Now go, I dare not delay you." Andrew nodded and quickly left the office. He had no desire to communicate with the angry chief. Oleg Nikolaevich had always been distinguished by a strict, explosive temperament. He was demanding towards his subordinates and gave no quarter, not even to his wife, Olga Alexandrovna, who was also the chief economist. They had started a business together and in 10 years managed to create a thriving company which Oleg now headed. He had all the qualities of a successful entrepreneur. He was determined, hardworking, courageous, goal-oriented, and fair to his subordinates. Oleg understood that his explosive nature could interfere with their common cause, and therefore tried to restrain himself as much as possible, not allowing himself to go beyond the boundaries of reasonableness. His wife, Olga, also helped him with this. She was beautiful, always well-groomed and elegant, and she knew her own worth. She thought that she played the role of a gray cardinal in front of her husband, and it suited her fine. However, one day when Oleg was away on a business trip, he called her and asked her to go to a meeting instead of him. "Olga, we definitely need to attend this meeting. We are one of the leading companies in town, and must defend our interests, especially since our competitors will be there. Of course, it would be better if I could attend myself, but unfortunately I will not be able to. The meeting with the investors is scheduled for tomorrow, and I cannot simply cancel or postpone it." "Don't worry, dear," reassured her husband, Olga. "After all, it's our joint business, and I am not a stranger to it either. The meeting with the investors is scheduled for tomorrow, and I cannot simply cancel or postpone it." "Don't worry, dear," reassured her husband, Olga. "After all, it's our joint business, and I am not a stranger to it either. The meeting with the investors is scheduled for tomorrow, and I cannot simply cancel or postpone it." "Don't worry, dear," reassured her husband, Olga. "After all, it's our joint business, and I am not a stranger to it either. So don't worry, everything will be fine. I can assure you I won't disappear." However, she disappeared as soon as she saw the brown eyes of her husband's main competitor, Vadim Larionov. He was a surprisingly attractive man, and Olga could feel the charm emanating from him almost physically. So when he approached her after the meeting and invited her for a cup of coffee, she could not refuse. "Is there something you would like to discuss with me?" she asked him as they went to a cozy cafe and placed their orders. "No," Vadim smiled softly. Sorry for the details, did not have time for breakfast today, and I decided to invite you to join me. I do not like to dine alone, and in your city I do not know anyone. All my friends and acquaintances are in the region. I recently bought this business. And where are you staying? In a hotel or something?" "No, I bought a house in Kedrovoy. It's quite big for just me, but I hope to have not only a wife but also children soon." Olga's eyebrows raised in surprise. Kedrovoy was an expensive and elite closed settlement, and only people with a high income could afford to live there. Olga was silent for a moment before asking, "Don't you have a wife?" She couldn't help but ask. No, I have been alone for 4 years. Tatiana has always dreamed of living in the States, but I do not like it there. In general, I feel like a stranger abroad, not like here. Anyway, we went our separate ways. As far as I know, she got married again, and I am slowly turning into a bachelor. I don't think you can do it, Olga laughed. The women in our city will not miss such a magnificent specimen, you can be sure of that. And you? Vadim asked, looking straight into her eyes and covering her hand with his palm. Olga felt like an inexperienced girl, her heart racing in her chest. Trying to control herself, she turned away but did not pull her hand away. And a few hours later, as she emerged from the bathroom in Vadim's gorgeous house, she smiled at him with the happy smile of a woman in love. She had forgotten about everything else in the world, not even remembering her husband. The business he had entrusted to her, not to mention the fact that she and her husband had lived soul to soul for many years. I think I've lost my mind, she told Vadim, wrapping herself in a soft, fluffy towel. And I like it so much, he replied, holding out his hand to her. When Oleg returned from his business trip, he immediately noticed that something was going on with his wife. However, she didn't answer his questions and only waved away his annoying concern. He then realized that she was just tired from managing the business alone and invited her to rest. Olga nodded excitedly. It would be good. To be honest, I wanted to ask you to do it myself. You won't mind if I pick up a sanatorium for myself and spend at least a few days there? Of course not, darling. You deserve a rest, Oleg replied. Soon Olga left and was gone for almost a week. Little did Oleg know that his wife had chosen not a resort, but the country house of her main competitor, Vadim Larionov. A few months had passed, and during this time, Oleg was completely immersed in work. He couldn't understand what was going on. Profits were plummeting, new contracts were not being signed on the best terms, and leading projects were slipping out of his hands. It was obvious that someone was deliberately sabotaging his business. Exhausted from trying to fix everything, Oleg left the office one day in severe irritation, and on the threshold he ran into a poorly dressed woman. "What is it?" he yelled at her. "Can't you see where you're going?" "Please help," she said, stretching out her hand to him. "Lord my God," exclaimed Oleg. "Begging should be done near the church, not here, in the business center." Despite his indignation, he reached into his pocket, took out a bill, and handed it to the woman. To his surprise, she recoiled and only waved her hands. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean that at all. I'm actually looking for a job. There's a sign on the door that says this place needs a cleaning lady." The woman quickly named Oleg's company and asked how quickly she could be found and who to contact. "I see," grinned Oleg. "And here I was thinking you were a beggar." The woman's face flushed with embarrassment. "Don't be embarrassed," said Oleg. "Go up to the 5th floor. There you will find Margarita Mikhailovna. Tell her that Oleg Nikolaevich has hired you and she will arrange everything." "And who is this Oleg Nikolaevich?" the woman asked. "Nikolaevich?" The woman didn't immediately understand. "It's me, Oleg Nikolaevich Zakharov, the director and owner of the company where you will be working. This means that I will soon be your supervisor. It's a pleasure to meet you," the stranger smiled softly. "My name is Victoria Petrovna." Her words were spoken with such directness that Oleg was surprised. He was used to his subordinates being bored, but this future cleaner, whom he mistook for a beggar, spoke to him as an equal. "I will remember," he grinned again and without turning around continued on his way. In another minute, his thoughts returned to his previous problems, and he had completely forgotten about Victoria's existence. And then something happened that threw him off balance for a long time. One evening, he received a call from a good friend whom he had helped more than once. "Listen, Oleg, I have some news. I don't even know how to say it." "Lasha, let's talk briefly and to the point," suggested Oleg. "I'm tired and don't want long explanations. As you say, in general, your business has decided to lay their hands on Vadim Larionov. I've heard of him." "How do you know?" "Acquired." "Wait, are you driving?" "Yes, I'm going home." "Why, pull over. I'll tell you something else. I need to digest this information. Come on, I'm waiting. Otherwise, there might be trouble." Oleg realized that his friend wasn't joking, so he pulled over and shut off the engine. "Talk, I'm all ears." "You are drowning your own wife." Olga has been dating Larionov for a long time. I only found out about it today, but the source is verified. There are even photos. In these photos, they are in a car, in a restaurant, in his house. In short, Larionov is on the hook with a reputable man, so he arranged for total surveillance on him. I happened to come across some photos, asked around, and got an answer. Oleg slapped his hands on the steering wheel with all his might, and cursed loudly. Then he was quiet for a while, trying to figure out what to do now. Lesha, can you send me those materials? Just some photos and scans? I don't have access to the full data. Alright, send it in. And thank you. I'm sorry, Oleg, but I couldn't keep quiet. Lesha, you have no idea what you have done for me now. I owe you, and I will never forget it. Nothing. I'm used to helping each other, said Lesha. For almost an hour, Oleg sat in the car, feverishly thinking about how he should behave in this situation. He had long suspected that there was a rat among his team, and he tried to figure out what to do. Try to figure out who it was. But how could he think of his wife? What were you missing, Olga? Asked Oleg. Emptiness, and got no answer. Oleg did not make a grand scandal. He just told his wife that he knew everything and demanded that she leave. In contrast to her husband, Olga threw him a real tantrum, saying that it was all his fault, that she had not felt like a woman for a long time, that he had chosen her job over her. And finally, she could not resist and said that she had purposely corrected the data in the documents, and now no one could find errors in the calculations. Vadim and I will get a new tender, she told Oleg, and then we will immediately go to the Emirates to celebrate our victory with a boat trip. Oleg opened the door for her. But when Olga left, he rushed around the apartment like a wounded animal, howling in heartbreaking pain. In the morning, he summoned Arkhipov to his office and ordered him to urgently study all the documents and look for errors in the calculations. He also made it clear that no one was allowed to leave their workplace without his permission. He shouted after the newly appointed chief economist. At 9 o'clock in the evening, Oleg decided to find out how things were progressing and what had already been done, so he invited the entire economic department to the conference room. The employees came, but they could not say anything sensible to him. With their heads down, they only thought about how he would leave for good and weather the storm. Oleg Nikolaevich could see it on their faces, and without holding back, he threw a glass into the wall, breaking it into small pieces. Strangely enough, this sudden release of anger brought Oleg's state of mind into relative equilibrium, and he looked at his terrified employees and began to speak quietly and calmly. He explained the real state of affairs, what was required of them, and made it clear that if they did not succeed, they could talk about the bankruptcy of the company. No one noticed the new cleaning lady, who silently started cleaning up the broken glass and wiping the floor with a wet rag. She carefully listened to what he said, trying not to miss a word of his speech. When he finished talking, Andrei Arkhipov got up from his seat. Oleg Nikolaevich, do not misunderstand me. Today has been a hard day, and although it did not bring the results we wanted, I am sure we will do very well. I suggest everyone go home today and rest, and in the morning, with renewed vigor, we will take up the documents again. Oleg Nikolaevich, believe me, we will do everything not to let you down. He nodded and waved his hand. Go away. Svetlana, Oleg's secretary, gathered all the documents, took them to the office chief, piled them on the table, and left the office in a hurry. Oleg himself was the last one to leave. But when he entered his office in the morning, his jaw dropped in amazement. Behind the desk, in a padded executive chair, a janitor was fast asleep, using the very documents that had caused him so much trouble as a pillow. What is this? Oleg exclaimed, taken aback by such audacity. Victoria raised her head and smiled. It's you, Oleg Nikolaevich. Hello. I asked what it is. He grumbled again, already losing his grip on reality. Are you normal at all? How do you behave? I found it. Victoria smiled again. Oleg fell silent, confused and unsure of what to say. But Victoria's words continued to shock him. I counted everything and found the mistakes you mentioned. In addition, I can offer you 2 ways to optimize the project, which will make it even more attractive to investors. She talked, and he looked at her in disbelief. Finally, he said, you need an economic education to understand all of this. I have two, Vika said seriously. What do you mean? Janitors have two higher educations. Economics too. You're not born a cleaner, you become one, Vika sighed. And if you're interested in my education, I'm a qualified mathematician, specializing in economics. I also graduated by correspondence from the Department of World Economy and International Economic Relations. That was, so to speak, for my own personal interest. She had just boasted about sitting in the head of the company's chair, while he stood in front of her like a boy with his mouth open. This particularly embarrassed Victoria, and she hurried to stand up from her seat. But Oleg immediately put her back in the chair and sat down next to her. Tell me everything about yourself, Victoria Petrovna. There's not much to tell. My father left when I was very young, and my mother quickly found a replacement. But my relationship with my stepfather didn't work out. He couldn't stand me for some reason. My mother didn't agree with him. And one day, when I was 10 years old, they left me in the care of my grandfather, and went abroad never to return. My grandfather was a professor, and Moscow State University was his home, so it's no surprise that when I grew up, I also went there and graduated summa cum laude. My grandfather loved me very much, but he was a very impractical man, unlike his son. While I was studying, I lived in the dormitory of Moscow State University. Well, in general, after university, I actually stayed on the street. From there, it was all trivial. I got married without any devotion, and my husband's family did not forgive me. For several years, they diligently turned him against me, and finally convinced him that I was a bad wife, a bad hostess, and generally a worthless creature. Yes, I don't cook very well. Only the simplest dishes, nothing complicated, but I haven't had a chance to practice it either. In my life, there were always canteens or cafes, and after I got married, for the whole family the cook was the cook. But it didn't matter. I worked in my husband's family business, running a shield, but it wasn't difficult there. Vika sighed and fell silent, but then, looking at Oleg, who listened to her with interest, continued. The rest was like in an unfunny joke. One day, I went to my husband's office and found him with a young secretary, so I left him. I tried to get a job, but my husband's family had given me such a reputation that they shunned me like a leper. Everyone was afraid to hire a liar and a cheater. In the meantime, the money, which was already scarce, ran out, and I had no choice but to get a job as a janitor or cleaner. That's when I came across your ad. That was it. Gear, I listened to what your employees were discussing. Then you yourself talked a lot about it, and I decided to help. And what you did, it all in a couple of hours. No overnight. I mean, you didn't even go home, did you? Vika smiled and shrugged her shoulders. I don't have a home. I used to sleep around train stations, and when you took me here, I started sleeping here in the waiting room. I asked the watchman not to turn me in. By the way, he's a very kind man. Victoria Petrovna, all my colleagues will gather now. Tell them the same thing. Vika was surprised again. No, I mean this, you point to the pile of papers. Victoria smiled. Yes, of course. I'll show and tell you everything. Oleg stood up and threw up his hands. No, it's still unbelievable. I've never heard anything like that. Well, okay, Victoria Petrovna, before our staff arrives, there is still time. Let's go with you to a boutique of fashionable women's clothing and pick something for you. You can't perform in front of people in that uniform. Especially since I am offering you a new high-paying position. Victoria looked around herself and said, well, okay. I wouldn't want to be mistaken for a beggar again. That's wonderful, Oleg exclaimed and smiled. And half an hour later, he couldn't take his admiring eyes off the transformed Victoria, who looked amazing in a blue pantsuit, perfectly complemented by a chiffon blouse. Victoria, you look amazing, he told her. She smiled embarrassedly and thanked him for his purchases. Before going back to the office, they went to a cafe and had breakfast. And then Oleg sincerely enjoyed watching the astonished faces of their employees, who both recognized and did not recognize the beautiful businesswoman as yesterday's cleaning lady, Victoria. They settled into her new office, and she simply and clearly explained the essence of the problem with the calculations to them, behaving calmly as if she had worked there for 100 years. In the evening, Oleg went up to her. Victoria, let's go home. Tong? She was surprised. Yes, he nodded and took her hand. A few days passed. Oleg and Victoria returned from a meeting with investors full of enthusiasm. Their project unequivocally took the lead, leaving far behind all the competitors, including Larionov, who left the meeting before it was over. The staff greeted them with applause, and Oleg immediately organized a buffet for everyone. And 3 months later, everyone celebrated Oleg and Victoria's wedding and sincerely wished them happiness. Andrei Arkhipov invited his secretary Svetlana to dance, who asked him casually, "Well, maybe it's time for us to follow the example of the bosses?" "I promise, if only you catch the bouquet of the bride," Andrei joked. "Come on. In fact, Oleg and Victoria were such a beautiful couple." "Have you heard about Olga?" "No? What happened to her?" "Larionov was put on trial for fraud and Olga is also involved. By the way, she's cleaning floors at the mall now." "Can you imagine? Margarita and I went to pick out a gift for the bosses, and we saw her there. She deserved it." Andrew smiled, left the old woman at a broken trough. "Hey, look. The bride is about to throw her bouquet." And after a few seconds, Svetlana waved him the cherished trophy. So that's the story. Subscribe to the channel and click on the bell so you don't miss new stories.